Aveva Cesare, il figlio ed Augusto.
His speeches leave Italy bewitched.
There was something almost magical that would suck people into his thinking. He, in effect, kind of hypnotized.
But behind all Benito Mussolini's bluster and posturing lies a dark heart of violence and brutality.
Adolf Hitler looks at Mussolini as someone who is providing a blueprint as to how to destroy the old order.
This is the story of Il Duce, the boss, and how his love of Italy inspires an epic rise to power. But whose devotion to inflicting fear ultimately brings his country to its knees. By the end of April 1945, Allied forces have liberated almost all of Italy from Nazi occupation. An occupation no Italian ever wanted. By Lake Como, close to the Swiss border, a large German SS convoy is heading north. When a small patrol of Italian partisans stop them at a makeshift roadblock. The Nazis in the lead jeep demand to be let through. But just as they're about to let the Germans pass, one of the men notices something strange. At the back of the vehicle, a man in Nazi uniform is trying not to be noticed. On closer inspection, they realize who it is.
He stopped at a roadblock, and although he's doing his best wearing a uniform to actually disguise himself, he's of course instantly recognized. And so is his lover at the time, Clara Petacci.
Il Duce, Benito Mussolini, Italy's fascist dictator, is arrested immediately. It's the final fall from grace for a man who held his country under an evil spell for over 2 decades. Mussolini's evolution begins in 1883 in the village of Pradapio in the Romagna region of northeastern Italy, where he is born into a family fallen on hard times.
The grandfather had to sell the family land, and I think somewhere in Mussolini's soul was the desire to reclaim family success.
Like so many in Romagna, he is raised in a family of radical socialists who are often jailed for their political beliefs. Mussolini's father is a blacksmith who spends more time womanizing and drinking than working at the anvil, leaving the family little money to survive.
Mussolini grew up with a really strong resentment of people who had more than he had. He knew he was much smarter than anyone else that he met, and yet he wasn't the beneficiary of privileges.
Fueled by his family's sense of injustice, young Benito is arrogant, volatile, and a bully.
Mussolini as a child was fairly wild, I think, unruly and anarchic.
Da ragazzo Mussolini era...
As a boy, Mussolini was a rebel. He was intolerant and very quarrelsome. Relationships with his peers were often violent.
violenti.
In games with friends, he hates to lose and often fights dirty to resolve disputes.
Durante una lotta con un rivale,
In a fight with a rival, he used a knife and injured the other boy very seriously.
lo ferì molto seriamente.
Non sono ammessi atti di violenza in questa scuola.
Aveva barato.
Mussolini is hauled before the fathers of his Catholic school, who he hates. They expel him, telling his parents he is beyond their control. But there is also a warm, loyal side to young Benito. These will be key to his rise to power. His brother and sister adore him. He is a dreamer who recites poetry and literature.
Mussolini was a great stage director of his own life. He had a lot of charisma and charm.
Popolo d'Italia,
From a young
risvegliatevi.
age,
Sono
he
lavoratore
rehearses
come voi.
making speeches.
Sono Benito Mussolini, seguitemi.
He practiced early on, sort of posing, and came to believe, I think, in his own theatrical image.
By the age of 18, the future dictator of Italy is a flamboyant, attractive young man, and like his father, a passionate socialist. Women are drawn to him like a magnet. But his volatile side keeps erupting.
E quindi impazziva per
He
le
was
donne.
crazy for women. He had a highly sexual personality, so any woman, young or old, to him was just an object to be preyed upon.
Diventasse per lui un oggetto di preda.
Throughout his life, Mussolini beds hundreds of women, often violently.
Mussolini, I think, tended to engage in the sort of sex that is best described as nasty, brutish and short.
Rather than be ashamed of beating and raping women, in later writings, he boasts about it.
Mussolini era
He was an egotist. As a result, some of his behavior was strange. This strangeness got him known as the madman of Predapio and the madman of Romagna.
il matto della Romagna.
In 1903, he avoids national service by escaping to Switzerland, where he's arrested for advocating a violent revolution. His mother dies shortly afterwards, and he goes completely off the rails.
E poi il più grande amore della sua
The
vita.
greatest love of his life was his mother, in true Italian style. She died when he was only 22, and for him, this was an extremely dark day, which he would remember for the rest of his life.
Tutta la vita.
When his father remarries, Mussolini takes an unhealthy interest in his new stepsister, 16-year-old Rachele. His father fears Benito will bring shame to the family by starting a relationship. Some might think incestuous. However, he will have her, no matter what.
Mussolini said that if this girl cannot be mine, I will shoot myself. And he made the gesture to do just that. The whole thing, though, was just an act. And at that time, he had no intention of killing himself.
Uccidersi.
In 1910, Benito and Rachele start to live together. But Mussolini is sex mad and soon abandons his stepsister and marries another woman, Ida Dalsa. They have a son together, Benitino, little Benito. It's not long before he grows tired of his new family and leaves them too. At this stage, there is no sign that Mussolini, the violent, womanizing socialist, can turn into one of history's most evil dictators. But cataclysmic world events are about to change everything. 1914. World War I erupts across Europe. At first, Italy stays neutral, but many argue they should fight for a share of the spoils. As an active socialist, Benito Mussolini initially supports his nation's neutrality. By now, he has moved to Milan and found a flair for journalism, stoked by his childhood love of literature. Still in his 20s, he is made editor of Italy's biggest-selling socialist newspaper, Avanti.
Avanti gave him that platform from which he could influence the political direction of the party itself. He was a fierce supporter of revolution in Italy.
But then he starts to think that the war could be the spark to transform the country, even start a revolution. If so, Italy must be part of it. In April 1915, he's arrested for organizing pro-war demonstrations. But the Socialists and Avanti don't share his views. He is expelled from the party and resigns from the newspaper. To get back at them, he starts a publication of his own.
He wants a platform for his ideas, and so he gets together money from various sources, and he sets up a newspaper called Il Popolo d'Italia, the People of Italy.
On the 24th of May 1915, Mussolini gets his wish as Italy finally joins the conflict. Having argued so passionately for war, now he can fight in it.
When Italy declares war in the spring of 1915, he volunteers. He gets wounded in an accident with a mortar. And there are photographs of him on crutches. After that, he goes back to his job as a newspaper editor.
While recovering, he writes editorials on his sickbed, and an idea starts to take form.
He began thinking that perhaps the route to a revolution in Italy might be to organize the veterans of the war after they came home. Mussolini referred to them as the aristocracy of the trenches.
Sure enough, when the war ends in 1918, Italy is in a miserable state and ripe for change. Despite being on the winning side, the country has gained almost nothing in the peace settlement. Communists and socialists are causing trouble on Italian streets, calling for a revolution like Russia's. By now, Mussolini has completely turned his back on the left. He wants to forge his own path, one based on the glory of Italy and its Roman past.
Mussolini had become more and more in love with his own country and dreaming about running it and thinking about how he could make it a great power.
He decides to put his ideas into action. He calls for a radical new movement to be formed, one which he will lead by the force of his personality.
Even though he seems to be kind of this warm guy, and people saw him sometimes as almost empathic, it's a veneer, it's a facade. And he knew that that warmth, that he seemed to give off was manipulating in itself.
Mussolini appeals to disillusioned war veterans who share both his anger with the old liberal parliamentary system and his fear of a communist takeover. They believe that extreme nationalism and a one-party state are what will make Italy great again. And they adopt the Roman axe, the fascio, as their symbol. They call themselves fascists. Many of them wear the black shirt of the Arditi, Italy's fearsome commando unit in the war.
The fascist black shirts, the street fighters, believed that political debates, voting, all of the trappings of democracy were either foolish or weak or a fraud. If you wanted something, you took it.
And Mussolini's thugs are armed to the teeth.
Fascists were very often led by demobilized junior officers, and they had access to weapons. Often they kept weapons themselves from the war. They had revolvers, but they also had more exotic weapons. The manganello, the heavy club, was one of their characteristic weapons, but knuckle dusters, sometimes even weird instruments. I mean, there's one fascist group, for example, that beat up its enemies using sticks of dried cod.
Mussolini becomes their leader, and they call him Il Duce, the boss. He organizes his fascists into fighting units, instructing them to beat and humiliate his opponents.
Gli squadristi prendevano I capi socialisti.
The units would attack the socialist leaders, capture them, tie fascist slogans around them, make them look ridiculous, force them to drink powerful laxatives, making them soil themselves, to destroy their public image.
La loro immagine. E I fascisti
And the fascists mocked them and took pictures, which then appeared in the newspapers.
Mussolini's fascist movement takes off, going from 20,000 to almost 200,000 members in just a few months. While his thugs battle communists in the streets, Mussolini tries to broaden his power base. The fascist movement becomes the Fascist Party, and in 1921, he is elected to parliament. Campaigning reveals his supreme skill. Throughout his career, with one masterful speech, the Duce can turn crowds into screaming, adoring hordes.
In cui Roma aveva Cesare, il Figlio ed Augusto.
He had the ability to move people, to control their emotions, to get them to listen to him, that he was eloquent and he was persuasive. There was something almost magical that would suck people into his thinking. You have these gigantic crowds shouting, Duce, 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 because he in effect kind of hypnotized them.
In 1922, as Italy descends further into chaos, Mussolini seizes the moment. Through the power of his oratory, he's going to mobilize enough fascists onto the streets to try to force the state to hand him power. He urges his supporters to march on Rome. But their leader isn't amongst them. Behind the scenes, the master of propaganda is working away.
He saw it as a kind of an act. He was staging what looked like a revolution, but at the same time secretly assuring the army leadership and the monarchy that this was only play acting.
Mussolini later claims hundreds of thousands join the march. In reality, only 16,000 bedraggled, mainly unarmed marchers show up. The police and army turn a blind eye.
It was an untypically wet October. They drowned whilst waiting. They didn't know what to do. No orders were coming. Mussolini was nowhere to be seen.
He's actually in Milan. He's really sitting beside the telephone waiting for other politicians to ring him up and say, "Psst, you want to be minister of this, or would you like to be perhaps prime minister?"
Terrified of a revolution, Italy's head of state, King Victor Emmanuel III, calls on Mussolini to lead a new coalition government. Through his ability to stir up the mob, the boss has bluffed and bullied his way to power. It's the beginning of Italy's descent into hell. While Mussolini attempts to be statesmanlike, his black shirts are still on the streets, causing mayhem. Violence has been his way of life, and now with power in his grasp, he has the means to inflict it on anyone who stands in his way. Socialist politician Giacomo Matteotti is making threats to expose the fascists' violent tactics. So he needs to be silenced. A unit of black shirts assaults Matteotti, who suffers a heart attack and is buried in a shallow grave just outside Rome.
When he realized that his own personal bodyguards had murdered this socialist member of parliament, he tried to cover it up.
When Matteotti's body is recovered, Mussolini denies any involvement, and the murder does its job. Political opponents are terrorized into silence. With Italy cowed into submission, he can fulfill his dream of a second Roman Empire, spanning the globe, with himself as the new emperor. Just like somebody else, a few hundred miles away. He receives a request asking for a signed photograph from an admirer in Germany. Mussolini refuses. He doesn't consider the letter writer important. That will soon change, because the letter is from the man who will devastate both his life and that of his country. Adolf Hitler. In 1925, the Duce declares Italy a dictatorship. All political parties are closed down, except the fascists.
Mussolini was completely anti-democratic. In his political model, there was no role for any kind of opposition.
With Italy under his complete command, Mussolini can indulge his greatest passion: showmanship.
Fascism was characterized by the cult of the leader, and Mussolini played up to this in a very big way and was always posing for the cameras. He had remarkable staring eyes. Everything was done to present him as a kind of Nietzsche-type Superman, a man who was virile, who was athletic, who was a great sportsman, who had a great torso, and he had no qualms about stripping to the waist and showing off his, as he would see it, his manly torso.
It really is impossible to imagine Adolf Hitler taking off his shirt and exhibiting himself, whereas Mussolini does get photographed bringing in the harvest. He's a mass-age politician.
Mussolini becomes a role model for every would-be dictator of the 20th century and beyond. At first, Italy prospers under fascism. A massive scheme of public works dramatically reduces unemployment. Mussolini reaches an almost divine status at home and abroad. Churchill hails him as a genius. FDR says he is deeply impressed by him.
Qual era l'immagine pubblica di Mussolini fuori dall'Italia?
The public image of him outside of Italy was completely positive, because from the outside it was a country of rebels and Mussolini had made it whole.
E Mussolini l'aveva messo a posto,
He had defeated the Bolshevik threat. He had made the trains run on time and had united a divided Italy.
Aveva messo l'Italia in divisa.
But controlling his own country isn't enough for the Duce.
One of the terms that sums Italy up very well, I think, is the idea that it was the least of the great powers, that it was bottom of the first division. And you can find Mussolini himself using that football metaphor.
He is particularly jealous of the great colonial empires of Britain and France.
Mussolini aveva l'ambizione di
Mussolini had the ambition to restore the Roman Empire. He wanted to send his fascist legions to where the Roman legions had gone before, including into Libya and North Africa.
del Nord.
Italy had controlled Libya since 1911. But after the First World War, Libyan tribesmen rise up against their imperial masters. Mussolini orders a brutal policy of pacification.
I suoi ordini al
He
generale
orders his generals to exterminate any opposition, to lock them in concentration camps.
campo di concentramento.
The Italian policy in Libya was a story of utter brutality, up there with the worst moments of European colonialism.
100,000 Libyan tribesmen are rounded up and forced to march across the desert. Most die on the journey. The majority are women, children, and the elderly. And for political leaders, there's an even worse punishment.
There was a saying among the Libyan Arabs, he went to Rome. But he never got to Rome. He was thrown out of the plane a couple of miles outside of the village. They eradicated these people and took the leader, Omar el-Mukhtar, and hanged him in front of 20,000 Libyans.
In total, around half of Libya's population are wiped out by Mussolini's crazed delusions of a new Roman Empire. But the rest of the world pays little attention to what's happening in North Africa. Apart from the newly elected Chancellor of Germany. In 1934, Adolf Hitler finally gets to meet the man he wrote to 8 years earlier. Mussolini remains unimpressed and describes him as a silly little clown.
Adolf Hitler looks at Mussolini as someone who is providing a blueprint as to how to destroy the old order. Hitler learns from Mussolini, and he has a deep affection for him that goes beyond just admiration. It's idolization of Mussolini.
At first, it's Hitler who apes his great hero, copying the fascist salute and many of the Duce's ideas. Mussolini relishes his superiority at the beginning of their relationship. He thinks he can bully Hitler, too. In a move that will inspire the Nazis, he spends billions expanding the military. His plan is to widen his empire. So he sends his forces to a country that had embarrassed Italy in a colonial defeat 40 years earlier. In the autumn of 1935, over 500,000 Italian troops invade Ethiopia in a savage act of revenge.
Mussolini turns to Ethiopia in part because that has long been an object of Italian imperial ambitions.
It is the largest colonial army ever put into the field, and the war becomes one of the 20th century's most one-sided conflicts.
Mussolini wanted to create a kind of copy of South Africa in Ethiopia. In other words, to turn the Ethiopian population into what amounted to slaves or serfs and create a massive immigrant population of Italians who would practice a kind of apartheid. But they did so with such violence, such cruelty, such ruthlessness. There was a massive revolt in the center of the country.
This was one of the most brutal campaigns ever waged by colonial power.
Ethiopia had virtually no air force, and Italian planes could simply fly over Ethiopian villages or Ethiopian armed forces and do whatever they liked to them.
And the Duce instructs his bombers to fight dirty.
He wanted this campaign to be over quickly, and by the end of the year he said we just simply got to use poison gas on a large scale. We just got to get this war finished swiftly.
In defiance of the League of Nations, Mussolini drops mustard gas on Ethiopia, something even Hitler refuses to deploy. Emperor Haile Selassie desperately appeals to the League of Nations to intervene. But they just look the other way. Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia leaves the Lion of Judah's impoverished nation devastated.
The Ethiopian historians think that the death toll during the war is somewhere above 350,000 people, so it's a massive death toll.
The Ethiopian War was really the beginning of the Second World War. Mussolini knew full well that invading Ethiopia, he was breaking the League of Nations. It was going to give a green light to Hitler. Hitler could now see that you could act in defiance of the League of Nations and get away with it.
The bond between Mussolini and Hitler grows tighter than ever. In league with the Nazis, the Duce sends troops to aid Franco's fascists, fighting the Spanish Civil War.
Both countries got involved in the Spanish Civil War from 36-39, and the verdict was completely different. Germany fought a very, very successful campaign. Italy, the Italians were defeated in Guadalajara in a very traumatic event again, and the comparison between the two was traumatic for Mussolini.
The Spanish campaign is the first sign the Nazi war machine is better equipped for conflict than his military. But the Duce ignores all advice. However, Mussolini's philandering has come back to haunt him. The first wife he abandoned, Ida Dalsa, and their son, little Benito, have been causing him problems. Mussolini subsequently married Rachele, his stepsister, but Ida keeps surfacing, tarnishing his image.
She wanted him all for herself, and so caused several scenes with Rachele Mussolini. The Duce found this situation intolerable, as it risked putting him in a bad light.
The fascist dictator's ruthless side reveals itself again, as he declares Ida to be mad and has her locked up.
He decided that this woman should be completely removed from view and either put in a psychiatric hospital.
In 1937, Ida Dalsa is allegedly beaten and dies of a brain hemorrhage in the asylum. A few years later, he orders his own son, little Benito, to be murdered by lethal injection. He is just 26. The Duce thinks his ruthlessness makes him untouchable. September the 27th, 1937. With his personal affairs now in order, Mussolini is invited to Germany. And Hitler pulls out all the stops to impress his idol.
He is absolutely astounded by the progress that Germany has made during those few years. He is blown over by the show of military might and order. He realizes that the balance of power has tipped already decisively towards Hitler.
As a man obsessed with showmanship and military might, Hitler presses all of Mussolini's buttons. The Duce becomes enthralled. The silly little clown is now the ringmaster.
Mussolini comes back from his visit to Germany with a sense that really, the future lies with Germany. He's really impressed by the Nazis.
It's not just Hitler's armies that win Mussolini over. He is becoming captivated by his ideas, too. He sees the persecution of Jews in Germany as a model for the introduction of his own anti-Jewish laws.
One of the greatest blots on Mussolini's reputation were the anti-Semitic decrees of November 1938.
Until the 1930s, Jews and Catholics had lived relatively peaceably, side by side in Italy. But now, just like Germany, Jews are stripped of citizenship and barred from holding official jobs. Marriage between Italians and Jews is declared illegal.
Italian racism is defined from 1938 onwards as increasingly in terms of Italy being defined in spiritual terms as a racial community. At the root of Italian spiritual identity is Catholicism, and therefore the Jews cannot be part of the Italian spiritual community.
Mussolini certainly plays a major role in the introduction of the anti-Semitic legislation and then in its continued expansion. Italian anti-Semitism remains essentially discriminatory rather than genocidal. The Italians aren't then, until then, imagining that they're going to kill their Jews. They're imagining that they're going to separate them from the rest of the population.
Fascist and Nazi ideology converge. A military alliance, the Pact of Steel, is signed between Italy and Germany. With it, Mussolini's and his people's fate are sealed. September the 1st, 1939, Hitler invades Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declare war on Germany. At first, Mussolini is unsure which way the war will go and tries to play the long game. But when Hitler conquers France, he is convinced there can be only one winner. On June the 10th, 1940, he throws in his lot with the Nazis. He's certain now Hitler is unstoppable, and by following him, he can fulfill his own imperial dreams. He couldn't be more wrong. He's been sucked into a conflict Italy cannot fight.
Italy is decidedly unprepared for a modern world war. Its economy remains the weakest of the competing great powers. All the advice that Mussolini gets in the spring anyway of 1940 is be careful, look, we really can't do this.
As Hitler's armies rampage through northern Europe, against all his generals' advice, Mussolini instructs his forces to begin their own separate invasions.
Without telling Hitler, he decides to go for the Balkans in a big way, and plans are drawn up for invasion of Greece, which it is assumed will be over fairly quickly.
For all Mussolini's success in Ethiopia, the invasion of Greece is a disaster. The Italian army is defeated and immediately retreat. The Nazis are forced to rescue their weaker ally and occupy Greece. On June the 22nd, 1941, Hitler independently attacks the Soviet Union. But Mussolini insists Italian troops have to be involved.
Mussolini guardava Hitler con ammirazione e con odio.
Mussolini looked at Hitler with admiration, but also hate. Hate because Hitler had become the master, and Mussolini had become simply an ally, and moreover a secondary ally. In the Russian campaign, Mussolini insisted on sending Italian troops, which Hitler didn't want.
Mentre Hitler non li voleva.
Because of their leader's desperation to please his master, around 30,000 Italians are killed on the Eastern Front, and another 50,000 die in captivity. In 1942, news filters through of further defeats to the British in North Africa. The war is becoming a humiliation for Italy. Mussolini's unstable personality emerges again, with violent mood swings and erratic behavior.
When Mussolini had aligned himself with Hitler, he developed this kind of manic, depressive kind of behavior, going from one extreme to another.
He takes refuge in his arrogance and self-obsession.
He believes that he can do no wrong. He's a great believer in his own intuition. He says to his son-in-law at one stage, "I am the most intelligent animal that's ever existed."
But his bluster seems absurd, given the tragedy about to engulf his people. In 1943, Italy is losing the war, and Mussolini becomes seriously ill with an ulcer that's plagued him throughout his life. His grip on the country is loosening, and the writing is on the wall for his regime. The Allies are bombing the entire peninsula and have invaded Sicily.
Air raids on the Italian cities take a huge toll, both in terms of material damage, but also on the morale of the Italian people. There are increasing food shortages, rationing comes in a major way, and people are getting increasingly desperate.
Despite the suffering of his people, the Duce is too proud to surrender.
His character begins to change. He becomes more isolated. He won't listen to anyone's advice.
Unable to accept any blame, Mussolini casts around for scapegoats.
Cercò di usare la propaganda.
He began to use propaganda in an effort to blame the war on the Jews. He started to blame his generals, and when disaster really struck, he accused the Italian people of not being in control of their own dreams and objectives. It was always somebody else's fault.
La colpa era sempre degli altri.
Italians who had once been frightened into submission, even his own political allies, now turn on their leader. Mussolini's son-in-law, Count Giano, leads a vote on the Grand Council to remove him from office and end the war. The king places him under house arrest. He is confined under armed guard.
Mussolini thought that he was finished. He wanted to dedicate himself to his family.
But if Mussolini thinks he can spend the rest of his days in relative peace, Hitler has other plans. In one of the most daring rescues of the war, he dispatches gliders to where Mussolini is being held in the mountains. Without a shot being fired, he is rescued and installed as head of a new puppet regime in the north of Italy, the Republic of Salo, under Nazi control. The reversal of roles is now complete. Mussolini, the once powerful leader who wrote the book on leading by intimidation, is now utterly subservient to Hitler.
He now served merely as a puppet, in a way just repeating the words Hitler had already written.
And Hitler places conditions on Mussolini's return. He tells him he must send what Jews remain in Italy to Auschwitz. 6,000 are sent to the gas chambers, making his regime complicit in the worst crime in history. Next, Hitler orders Mussolini to execute the members of his government who had conspired to have him removed, including his own son-in-law, Count Gian. Isolated and hated by his people, reviled by his own family, his love of the Nazis and a new Roman Empire brings him close to the end.
Mussolini confessed to being finished, to being a walking corpse. The Italian population cursed the war and cursed Mussolini. In this period, he was a broken man, responsible for an Italian catastrophe.
Even worse, it's all been for nothing. Little by little, the Nazis are driven out of Italy. The Duce tries to escape with one of his many mistresses, Claretta Petacci, but the game is up.
Orders come through that Mussolini should be executed before the Allies get their hands on him, that it should be the Italian people who make judgment over him.
E adesso morirai per tutti I crimini che hai commesso in Italia, brutto bastardo. Muori, Mussolini.
Mussolini and Claretta Petacci's bodies are driven to the Piazzale Loreto in Milan. There, the Italian people, shattered by a war only their leader wanted, display their feelings.
Mussolini's corpse was battered, spat upon. His head was kicked in, and the bodies were tied around the ankles and then hoisted up so that the corpses hung upside down.
Today, there is a small minority in Italy who admire Mussolini and long for another fascist age when the trains run on time.
I think Italians have still not come to terms with Mussolini. He still has a certain appeal to young people. They are looking for direction and see him as a role model with clear ideas. His ideas may have been clear, but all they brought was a massacre.
Fascists choose to forget Mussolini led his country into a senseless war they were hopelessly unprepared for. They forget he had become Hitler's lapdog. They forget he was personally responsible for the deaths of around 1 million people in Italy and Africa, and participated in the Holocaust. A high price to pay for trains that run on time.